You are standing in a churchyard at 2 in the morning, and the ground in front of you has already been dug up once tonight. Not by you, by someone who got there first. Your body, if you die poor, in early 19th century Britain, does not belong entirely to you. It belongs, in a very real sense, to whoever can get a spade into the earth before your family notices. The soil has been disturbed. That sounds like the opening of a horror story. It isn't. It's a Tuesday in London, Edinburgh, or Dublin in the 1820s. For decades, this wasn't rumor. It was infrastructure. An entire quiet economy existed to move the newly dead from the ground to the dissection table, and almost nobody who could afford a locked, guarded grave ever had to think about it. Let's start with why any of this was necessary at all. Britain, in the early 1800s, was training more doctors than it ever had before. Surgery was becoming a real profession, not a trade learned by watching an older man cut and hoping for the best. Medical schools in London, Edinburgh, and Dublin were expanding fast, and every single one of them agreed on the same basic principle. You cannot learn the human body from a textbook. You have to open one up. Here is the problem. The law only allowed medical schools to use the bodies of executed murderers for dissection. That's it. Under a law from 1752, called the Murder Act, dissection was treated as an extension of punishment. Your body could be cut open by strangers as a final humiliation, a fate considered worse than the noose itself. So do the math. In a given year, England might execute somewhere around 50 to 70 people for capital crimes, some years fewer. Meanwhile, by the early 1800s, London alone had roughly 1,000 medical students who all needed hands-on dissection experience to become competent surgeons. One school, one class could need dozens of bodies a year just for itself. 50 legal cadavers a year, 1,000 plus students who needed to learn anatomy or risk killing their future patients through ignorance. The math didn't just fail to work, it collapsed completely. Why did surgeons care so much about dissection specifically, rather than just reading anatomical diagrams? Because the diagrams themselves were built on centuries of guesswork, mixed with too little real observation. The great anatomist John Hunter, working in London in the late 1700s, had spent decades arguing that surgery without direct anatomical study was closer to butchery than medicine. Hunter amassed his own private collection of specimens, many acquired through the same shadowy channels everyone else used, precisely because he believed a surgeon who had never traced a nerve or an artery with his own hands by candlelight had no business holding a scalpel over a living patient. By the early 1800s, his former students were running the very medical schools, now desperate for bodies, and they had inherited his conviction, along with his teaching methods. A surgeon who trained on diagrams alone might mistake an artery for a vein mid-operation. In an era before anesthesia, before antiseptics, before any real understanding of infection, a mistake like that meant a patient bled to death on the table in front of a room of terrified students. So dissection wasn't an academic preference. It was, by the standards of the time, the only thing standing between a competent surgeon and a dangerous one. And into that gap stepped the resurrection men. That's what they called themselves, with a kind of grim humor. Resurrectionists, body snatchers. Their job was simple in concept and horrifying in practice. Dig up a freshly buried body under cover of darkness and sell it to a medical school before it decomposed too far to be useful. Let's reconstruct how this actually worked. Because the mechanics matter, a resurrection gang would watch the death notices in the newspaper. A poor family buries someone, usually within a day or two of death. Because there's no money for embalming and no cold storage, the gang waits a night, sometimes only a few hours, then moves in with wooden spades. Because metal ones make noise against stone, they dig down only at the head end of the grave, just enough to expose the coffin lid. They break it open, loop a rope or a sack under the arms, and haul the body straight up, leaving the coffin and the burial clothes behind in the hole. This detail is not incidental. Stealing a body was, under English common law at the time, a lesser offense than stealing property. Because a corpse was not legally considered anyone's possession, stealing the shroud, the coffin, or the burial goods, however, was theft, and could get you properly prosecuted. So the gangs left the fabric and the wood, took only the body, and filled the hole back in before dawn, sometimes so neatly that families never noticed. A fresh adult body might sell to an anatomy school for anywhere from a few pounds up to 10 or more, depending on the season, the condition, and how desperate the school was. In winter, when bodies kept longer, and demand from new terms of students spiked, prices climbed higher. Whose graves were targeted? Overwhelmingly, the poor. Families with money could afford mortsafes, iron cages bolted over a fresh grave, or watchtowers where relatives took shifts, guarding a loved one's body for weeks, until it was too decomposed to be worth stealing. You can still see mortsafes today, in churchyards across Scotland, rusted iron lattices sitting over centuries-old plots, a physical monument to how frightened ordinary families were of what might happen to their dead. If you couldn't afford an iron cage, or a paid watchman, your grave was simply softer ground. Poverty didn't just define how you lived, it defined whether your body was safe once you died. Think about what that meant for how ordinary families grieved. A funeral in this period wasn't just an emotional ritual, it became a logistics problem with a deadline. Some poor families paid for a night watchman in shifts, taking turns themselves in the freezing dark, armed with nothing but a lantern and the threat of a shout to wake the neighbors. Others buried their dead in unmarked, shallow, temporary graves deliberately, then quietly moved the body to a permanent plot. Weeks later, once decomposition had made it worthless to a resurrectionist, church officials in some parishes began stacking heavy stone slabs directly over fresh graves, only removing them once the danger had passed. None of this stopped the trade. It only priced the poorest families out of protecting their dead entirely, because a night watch, a mortsafe, or a stone slab all cost money that many simply didn't have. The medical school's relationship to all this was an open secret. Surgeons like Sir Astley Cooper, one of the most prominent anatomists in London, and personal surgeon to King George IV, openly acknowledged buying bodies from resurrection men, while publicly insisting he never asked exactly where they came from. He is recorded as saying that with enough money, there was no person, however illustrious, whose body he couldn't obtain for dissection, if he wanted it. The London teaching hospitals paid resurrectionists well, and often looked the other way about the details, because the alternative was training surgeons, who had never actually seen inside a human body, before operating on a living one. Then, in 1828, the arrangement curdled into something far darker, and it happened in Edinburgh. William Burke and William Hare didn't start as grave robbers at all, they started as opportunists. When an elderly lodger in Hare's boarding house died owing rent, the two men sold his body to a well-known Edinburgh anatomist, Dr. Robert Knox, for £7.10, a substantial sum. No digging required, no graveyard risk, just a body that happened to be lying around. They realized immediately this was easier, faster, and more profitable than digging up graves in the cold, so they stopped waiting for people to die naturally. Over roughly 10 months, Burke and Hare murdered at least 16 people, mostly the vulnerable and the invisible, lodgers, the elderly, sex workers, people whose disappearance nobody with power would investigate too closely. Their method became known afterward as burking, suffocating a victim by pressing down on the chest, while covering the nose and mouth, a technique chosen specifically because it left no obvious marks of violence for an anatomist to notice. On the dissection table, each body went to Dr. Knox's anatomy school, no questions asked, or at least none asked loudly enough to matter. They were finally caught when other lodgers discovered a body hidden under a bed. Hare turned King's evidence, testifying against Burke in exchange for his own immunity, which tells you something about how the legal system valued information over consistent justice. Burke was convicted and hanged in January 1829, in front of a crowd, historians estimate, at 25,000 people, an enormous public spectacle. And here is the detail that closes the loop with grim precision. Burke's own body was publicly dissected afterward, and his skeleton is still on display today at the Anatomical Museum of the University of Edinburgh. The man who sold 16 murdered bodies to science ended his story on the very same table. Robert Knox, the anatomist who bought the bodies, was never criminally charged. Historians still debate how much he genuinely didn't know versus how much he simply chose not to ask. What's undisputed is that his public reputation was destroyed. Mobs targeted his home. His medical career in Edinburgh never recovered. There's something worth pausing on here. Burke and Hare weren't strangers stalking Edinburgh's wealthy neighborhoods looking for victims. Every single one of their victims came from their own social world. Fellow lodgers, an elderly street vendor, a woman known locally simply as Daft Jamie, people whose absence the city's respectable classes were never going to notice or investigate. That wasn't incidental to the crime. It was the entire business model. The same invisibility that let poor bodies vanish from graveyards unmourned by anyone with influence also let living, breathing poor people vanish from the street, one by one, for the better part of a year, before anyone in a position of authority asked a serious question. If you think Burke and Hare were an isolated horror, London had its own nearly identical case. A few years later, in 1831, a gang known afterward as the London Burkers, led by John Bishop and Thomas Williams, was caught trying to sell the body of a boy believed to be about 14 years old to King's College London. Anatomists there grew suspicious of how fresh and how suspiciously uninjured the body appeared, for someone claimed to have died of natural causes and alerted the police. Investigation revealed Bishop and Williams had likely murdered at least 2 or 3 victims, using the same suffocation method Burke and Hare had used in Edinburgh. Both men were convicted and hanged in 1831, and yes, their bodies were dissected too. By this point, Parliament could no longer treat the anatomy trade as a distasteful but tolerable inconvenience. 2 Burking scandals in 3 years, both directly tied to legitimate medical schools, had turned a quiet public unease into open public horror. So in 1832, Parliament passed the Anatomy Act. Here's what it actually did, and it's worth sitting with the specifics, because the fix Parliament chose reveals exactly whose bodies had been considered disposable all along. The Act expanded legal access to bodies for dissection beyond executed murderers. It now allowed medical schools to use the unclaimed dead, anyone who died in a workhouse, hospital, or prison, whose body went unclaimed by family within a set period, typically 48 hours. It also allowed a person's next of kin to legally donate a body in exchange for a small payment, usually enough to cover a basic funeral for the rest of the family. Read that again. The law didn't stop poor bodies from ending up on dissection tables. It simply made it legal, official, and no longer requiring anyone to dig at night. If you died in a workhouse, the very institution built to house the poorest people in Britain, and no family came forward fast enough, your body could now be lawfully sent to a medical school. The wealthy, who died in their own homes, surrounded by family who could claim them immediately, were essentially untouched by the new law. The mechanism of who ended up on the table barely changed, only the legal cover around it did. Consider what daily life inside a workhouse actually looked like for the people this new law now applied to. Workhouses were meant to be a last resort for the destitute, the elderly with no family left to support them, orphan children, the chronically ill unmarried mothers, turned away by their own relatives. Conditions were deliberately harsh, built on the idea that help should feel worse than the poverty it was meant to relieve, so that no one would seek it, unless they had absolutely no other option. Families inside a workhouse were often separated by sex and age, housed in different wings, sometimes barely permitted contact. So when someone died inside one of these institutions, the 48-hour window the Anatomy Act allowed for relatives to claim the body wasn't a small technicality. For a family already separated, already struggling, already possibly unaware a loved one had even died, 48 hours could pass before anyone found out at all. Grave robbing didn't vanish overnight, but it declined sharply within a decade, because medical schools no longer needed to pay resurrection men. When workhouse bodies arrived through the front door, with paperwork attached, historians still debate how to weigh the Anatomy Act. Some frame it as a genuine, if flawed, public health reform, one that finally gave surgeons a stable, legal supply of bodies and effectively ended the murder-for-profit incentive that Burke, Hare, Bishop, and Williams had exploited. From a purely practical standpoint, it worked. Burking as a crime essentially disappeared in Britain after 1832, because the entire financial incentive behind it evaporated. Once workhouse bodies became a legal, steady, and far cheaper supply than paying resurrection men or committing murder, surgeons no longer had to negotiate in back alleys at midnight. Medical schools no longer risked prosecution for receiving stolen goods. By that narrow measure, the law solved exactly the crisis it was written to solve. Others argue it simply formalized a system that had always treated poverty as a kind of consent, shifting the exploitation from criminal to bureaucratic, without ever asking the people involved what they actually wanted done with their own bodies. The act was debated in Parliament, specifically, as a bill to deal with the lower orders, language used openly at the time by its own supporters, who argued that the destitute owed something back to the society that had housed and fed them, even in death. No workhouse resident was ever asked in advance whether they wanted this arrangement. The choice, such as it was, belonged entirely to relatives who might not even know their loved one had died in time to object. Both readings are supported by the historical record, and honestly, both are probably true at the same time. A law can end one injustice by institutionalizing a smaller version of the same one. And Britain in 1832 seems to have done exactly that, with barely any public objection from the people it most directly affected. There's a modern mirror here that's easy to miss if you don't look for it. Today, organ and body donation for medical science relies almost entirely on informed consent. You sign a card, you register with the National Donor System. Nobody can legally take your body or parts of it for research or transplant without your prior agreement or your family's explicit permission after your death. That principle, that your body remains yours, even after you can no longer use it, exists specifically because of what happened in the opposite direction 2 centuries ago. The Anatomy Act of 1832 is, in a strange way, the ugly first draft of modern medical consent law. It just took Britain another 130 years, until the Human Tissue Act of 1961 and later reforms, to actually center the wishes of the dead person, rather than the convenience of the institution holding their body. And here's the quieter, stranger echo that connects directly back to where we started. Right now, in hospitals and universities all over the world, people still choose to donate their bodies to medical science. Precisely, so students can learn anatomy the same way Astley Cooper's students did 200 years ago, hands-on, in a dissection room, learning from a body that used to be a person. The need never disappeared. What changed was who gets asked first. There's a smaller, stranger echo too, one that has nothing to do with law, and everything to do with teeth. In the years after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, so many young soldiers died on that single battlefield, that dentists across Europe harvested their teeth by the thousand to make into dentures for the wealthy, a grim product that came to be marketed, quite openly, as Waterloo teeth. A body's usefulness to the living, it turns out, didn't end with dissection. Even a person's teeth could be repurposed as consumer goods, sold to people who never asked where a perfect set of dentures had actually come from. It's worth sitting with the fact that this practice wasn't hidden or shameful at the time. It was advertised as a selling point. So picture that churchyard again. 2 in the morning, the ground already disturbed. Somewhere between then and now, the question shifted from who can afford to keep their body safe after death to who is willing to give theirs away. That shift took a body-snatching trade, 2 murder scandals, and an act of parliament to happen, and it still isn't finished.